Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Left-Handed Woman. Essays by Judith Thurman. Narrated by Niemi. Introduction. Collecting Oneself. I write with my left hand. Left-handedness used to be considered a malign aberration. Sinister is Latin for left. And in the generations before mine, left-handed schoolchildren were routinely switched. Enforced conformity, especially, perhaps, when it selects an inborn trait to repress or persecute, breeds intolerance for difference of all kinds. Singled out for bullying or conversion, a child internalizes the message that she isn't right. I have a bittersweet memory in this regard. My father had been switched by an implacable Hebrew schoolteacher who'd made him sit on his left hand for 6 years. Even in old age, he still flexed it compulsively, though I reckoned that other childhood humiliations had also numbed him. Our relations were mostly silent, and I pined for his attention. But when I was learning to write, he sat patiently by my side, holding my wrist so it wouldn't hunch over like a cripple's back. He wanted to endow me with a beautiful hand, the signature of a lady. I don't think he realized how illegible his love was. In the contemporary world, belonging to the left-handed minority, about 10% of the population, is a minor inconvenience. But when I started kindergarten, at the height of the McCarthy hearings, my mother, Alice, warned me not to describe myself as a lefty. Why? I asked her. It could get us into trouble, she said darkly. I had no idea what she meant, and her anxiety was cockeyed, since my parents' only cell was our 4-room apartment. Yet the tone of that caution sobered me to the core. It hinted at a guilty secret that a careless word could betray. My mother's demons, her abiding terror of some imminent catastrophe, still haunt me. By the time I could see her with detachment, she was a sedated recluse who had designated the task of living to her only child. In that sense, our roles were reversed. I attuned my behavior to her fragility. I don't know what her own aspirations might have been, except that she revered language, and her gift to me was insisting that I should. During the Depression, she'd taught Latin and English in a Boston high school, but on her wedding day, she forfeited the job. It went to a man, she was told by the principal, who had a family to support. Alice accepted her dismissal timidly, without questioning its injustice. Perhaps her ambitions for me were a deflected protest. I was lucky, however, to have 2 maiden aunts. The feisty old maid in an uptight family is often an ally to her wayward niece. Eva, my father's sister, managed a used bookstore near Harvard Square. She was wraith-like and tweedy, with a smoker's deep voice and wrinkles. Eva's a character, the family liked to say. Whatever small luxury they sent her, a toaster, a winter coat, a banknote tucked into a birthday card, she gave it away. It went to a poet on scholarship or to the unwed mother who lived upstairs. I first heard the expression free love from Eva, uttered with reverence. She meant something heretical, I think. She meant to let me know that virginity is a false idol. Even as a child, I marveled at her ardor. Unlike Eva, my maternal Aunt Charlotte wasn't a romantic, though, unlike her sister, she inhabited a body that gave her pleasure. Archie, as I called her, was built like an otter and could swim 2 miles in the ocean. She taught me to ride a bike and to build a campfire. She had spent her youth as an activist in the settlement house movement. Later, she ran a state unemployment bureau staffed mostly by closeted socialists like herself. Archie took a dim view of patriarchal institutions, religion, capitalism, marriage. She liked to quote one of her professors at a woman's college. He has to be a very good husband to be better than no husband at all. Both my aunts got stuck caring for their elderly parents well into middle age, but then they moved into their own bachelor digs not far apart in Cambridge. They often traveled together adventurously. Had they been born in a later era, they might have been lesbians, and perhaps they were covertly. I hoped so, though we never spoke of intimate things. Of course she was a lesbian, Alison Bechdel said to me of Archie. I was visiting her in Vermont, reporting the profile in this volume. Straight women didn't dress up as Gene Autry, a singing cowboy of the 1950s. When I stayed with my grandparents, as I did every summer, Archie sang me to sleep in a Stetson, chaps, and a six-shooter. At the age of 80, Archie came to live with me and helped me to raise my son. I, too, was an unwed mother. I once asked her if she was happy. We were living in Paris for a year while I did research on Colette. She kept house for us without a word of French, and her only company for most of the day was a rambunctious 2-year-old. "You're too sentimental about happiness," she said. No critique has served my craft better. The writers I most admire never use a careless word. Their sentences are unimprovable. Style is character, Joan Didion asserted in an essay on Georgia O'Keeffe, whose surface is as taut as a drumskin. Didion's character was elusive, above all to herself, unlike O'Keeffe's, an artist she wrote with palpable envy who seems to have been equipped with an immutable sense of who she was. A style like Didion's is often the result of arrogance, painfully unlearned. All men are deceived by the appearances of things, Heraclitus wrote 2,500 years ago, even Homer himself, the wisest man in Greece. The poet was alerted to his self-deception by boys catching lice. What we catch and kill we leave behind, they told him, but what escapes us we bring with us. What we bring with us, embedded in our flesh and bugging it, embedded in art and animating it, is the mystery of how we become who we are. That mystery has been my subject from the beginning. With every new piece of work, I grope my way into it. First Impressions, a reportage on Paleolithic art, suggests my point of departure. It recounts the accident by which 3 spelunkers found an entrance to the Chauvet Cave, which had been sealed for millennia. They were attracted by an updraft of cool air coming from a recess near the cliff's ledge, the potential sign of a cavity. There's a hidden cavity in every story, a recess of meaning, and it's often blocked by the rubble of your own false starts, or by an accretion of received ideas left behind by others. That updraft of freshness is typically an emotion you've buried. I write about the lives and work of other people in part to understand my own, while avoiding what I feel obliged to do here, talk about myself. In most of my essays, a passage or even just a sentence surprises me with a private truth I couldn't otherwise have expressed freely. In my study of Emily Dickinson, it's a reflection on depressive mothers. Their daughters, I write, often feel a propitiatory impulse to make some sacrifice of their aggression and desire, perhaps because they feel guilty about their own vitality. In my reading of Elena Ferrante, it's a riff on primal attachments, for which hostile love is an antidote. Ambivalence, I suggest, is Alison Bechdel's default mode. The voice that narrates her graphic memoirs both yearns for and mistrusts closeness. In taking the measure of Rachel Cusk, I begin with a description of her narrator, a Cusk-like British writer named Fay. Friends and strangers tell her their stories, and she listens intently. As these soliloquies unspool, a common thread emerges. The speakers suffer from feeling unseen, and in the absence of a reflection they are not real to themselves. While sharing their dilemma covertly, Faye lends herself as a filter to her confidants, and from the murk of their griefs and sorrows, she extracts something clear, a sense of both her own outline and theirs. After 50 years of dissembled groping, I thought of calling this collection Wear and Tear. "You'll frighten off young readers," a friend warned me. Indefinite Article was another wry title that appealed to me, but it alluded too obliquely to The Left-Handed Woman, a novella by Peter Handke. The connection merits an aside. Handke found the title I have re-borrowed from him one evening in Paris, where we'd met in the early 70s. I'd moved abroad after college, and those years in Europe were my graduate school. Every aspect of its culture, class, speech, dress, food, decor, politics, and sex, especially sex, was coded in a manner both fascinating and arcane to the provincial American I was. Decrypting the codes was good training for my future vocation. I had one mentor in particular, an elegant Frenchwoman with whom I used to stay. She balanced a prestigious career with her duties as the wife of an important man, and her life seemed glamorous, though I aspired to a different one. Madame G. worried it wouldn't be secure, or not, as she liked to say, when you're alone at my age. Perhaps I'd related our conversations to Peter, I don't remember, but when he read the note my hostess had left on the kitchen table, it made him laugh. "Ce soir, à 9 heures, réunion des féministes gauchères américaines." She'd invited another friend to dinner, also a left-handed expatriate who shared my outspoken allegiance to women's liberation. I suspect her teasing tone appealed to him as much as its suggestion of a naively militant New World sisterhood. He took out a notebook and wrote something down. Men are a minority in this volume, if not in this introduction, and 4 of the 7 were couturiers who spent their careers styling and eroticizing the feminine figure, at times perversely. The true function of fashion, Charles James believed, is to arouse the mating instinct. Yet unlikely affinities are sometimes the most revealing ones. Alexander McQueen, for example, was often accused of misogyny. He was pugnaciously gay and working class. He brutalized his clothes and sometimes his models, and he killed himself at 40. But on his right arm he'd tattooed a line of poetry spoken by Helena in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Love looks not with the eyes, but with the mind. That anguished outcry by a lost woman whose desire is mocked and rejected alludes to a wound that McQueen's work and mine both seek to dress. The transcendence of shame is a prominent theme in the narrative of women's lives. The shame of violation, the shame of appetite, the shame of anger, the shame of being unloved, the shame of otherness, the shame, perhaps above all, of drive. 75 years ago, in the lower middle-class milieu where I grew up, the career prospects for a girl who couldn't tap dance were depressingly limited. I scoured literature for exceptions, and there were some, but nearly all of them had achieved distinction at a price their male counterparts didn't have to pay. In that respect, one might say they were all left-handed. They defied the message that they weren't right. The price of self-possession used to be spinsterhood, if not the convent. "I'm always happiest when dressed almost like a nun," Mucha Prada once remarked. "It makes you feel so relaxed." A few brazen rebels braved ostracism. The 2 Georges, Sand and Eliot, welcomed their exemption from polite society. It gave them more time for their spinning. A few women writers found exemplary spouses, wives, in essence, of whom Leonard Woolf and Alice B. Toklas are the epitomes. But many of those unions were childless, and it's still a daunting feat to juggle art and maternity. Even Colette, that great poet of female carnality, felt unsexed by the exercise of her powers. She'd understood before almost anyone that gender is a bell curve. Yet she despaired of being what she enviously called a real woman. The real women were her husband's mistresses. It wasn't obvious to my generation how or if one could become oneself, an individual, without performing what the psychoanalyst Louise Kaplan memorably called a female-female impersonation. In resisting a generic definition, many of my subjects have fetishized uniqueness. The witch, the sibyl, the priestess, the martyr, the diva, the vestal, the femme fatale, these are some of their guises. A stylist aims for unsparing specificity, but a stylized persona risks becoming a caricature. Margaret Fuller, born in 1810, is a poignant example. She was the first American foreign correspondent of her sex and the author of a foundational work of feminist history. "I shall always reign through the intellect," she boasted. But her dazzling mind was housed in an unlovely carapace, and she resigned herself to being bright and ugly. I recognized my own grandiosity in Fuller's. Until puberty, I too was outsized and ungainly. I compensated as she did by showing off as a know-it-all. One of my teachers mocked me with the epithet Miss Importance, and she cast me in our school play, The Mikado, as Katisha, a deluded old woman who is spurned by a prince. Since I couldn't carry a tune, I had to deliver her solos in sing-song. My soul is still my body's prisoner. I later destroyed all my class pictures. In rereading these essays and profiles, all but two of which were published in The New Yorker between 2006 and 2021, I was proud to realize how much I managed to write. It was a bleak era in my own history and America's. We were both coming apart. But I also felt a pang of obsolescence, an awareness of the extent, as Didion puts it, to which the narrative on which many of us grew up no longer applies. She believed that loss was peculiar to her generation, though I suspect each aging one is similarly humbled. "Whatever I have made for myself is personal," she concluded ruefully. "If I could believe that going to a barricade would affect man's fate in the slightest, I would go to that barricade. But it would be less than honest to say that I expect to happen upon such a happy ending." There are, however, some endings which give you a taste of happiness. Most of the time, a piece of prose lies on the page bristling with cleverness yet inert until I hit upon the precise sequence of words, the spell, if you like, that brings it to life. At that moment, language recovers its archaic power to free a trapped spirit. Unstill Lives. Roving Eye. The American model and photographer Lee Miller was born in Poughkeepsie, New York, a century ago, but spent most of her life seeking adventure in Europe and the Middle East. Last September, a retrospective of her work in front of and behind a camera, The Art of Lee Miller, curated by Mark Hayworth Booth, opened at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. In his introduction to the show's companion volume, Hayworth Booth describes Miller as an artist of the first electric century, and he invokes the metaphor of electricity, its power to attract, repel, shock, and illuminate, in making a case for her significance. Miller's power, however, generated an uneven legacy, notably indebted to her lover Man Ray, to her mentor Edward Steichen, and to Eugene Atget, Edward Weston, Brassai, and Paul Strand. Her audacious sexual history has colored perceptions of her art, as has her enshrinement by the fashion world. She traded on her exceptional beauty while it lasted, but she also struggled for respect and for something more elusive, self-respect. The formal tension in her work is a play between veiling and exposure, glamour and brutality. It carries an erotic charge even when the subject isn't erotic. On my way to the London preview, I stopped to ponder a startling image of Miller in a show of military and couture camouflage at the Imperial War Museum. The French were the first, in 1915, to experiment with disruptive patterns of light, shade, and color hand-painted on uniforms and artillery, a technique indebted to Cubism. In 1940, the rich and eccentric British surrealist Roland Penrose decided that he could best contribute to his country's defense by recruiting artists for a camouflage unit and lecturing on their research to the Home Guard. The unit had been testing an ointment developed to hide skin from a rifle scope, or at least to disguise it, and on a summer day in a friend's garden, Penrose asked Miller, his mistress — they married a few years later to legitimize their only child, Antony — to play the guinea pig. Miller was in her mid-30s. She had been covering the Blitz for British Vogue, and after the Normandy invasion, she would help to document the liberation of Europe as one of an elite company of women. Margaret Bourke-White, Marguerite Higgins, Mary Welsh, Helen Kirkpatrick, and Martha Gellhorn, among others, accredited as war correspondents. That afternoon, she gamely stripped for the assembled house party, smeared the dull greenish paste over her body, and stretched out on the lawn under a caul of camouflage netting. In the course of the demonstration, her groin was covered by a clump of sod bristling with matted weeds, a trompe l'oeil pubis, and one of her nipples snagged in the net. As a finishing touch, the severed heads of 2 blood-red lilies were placed between her breasts like a funerary offering. The couple's friend and partner in a menage a trois, the American photojournalist Dave Sherman, captured the scene, and Penrose used the image in slideshows, no doubt to great effect with the guardsmen. The earliest known nude study of Lee Miller, who was christened Elizabeth, was made by her father, Theodore, an engineer whose hobby was photography. He titled the picture December Morn, even though it was taken in April 1915, 2 weeks before Elizabeth's 8th birthday. Poughkeepsie had been blanketed by a spring snowfall, and the shivering little girl is posed outside the family house wearing nothing but bedroom slippers. A year before, as Carolyn Burke observes in a fine biography, Lee Miller, A Life, the likeness of a fleshier maiden, September Morn by the French painter Paul Chabas, had provoked a storm of outrage and titillation when it was displayed in the window of a Manhattan gallery. The public rallied to one side or the other, and Theodore, a health faddist, eventually took the liberal view. He had persuaded Lee's mother, Florence MacDonald, a Canadian nurse from a respectable family, to pose nude for him before they were married, and if he later philandered with impunity, she considered divorcing him to marry a lover. They kept up appearances, but something in the household was seriously peculiar. Lee became a promiscuous hellion. Her older brother John was a cross-dresser. Florence attempted suicide. Theodore continued taking nude pictures of his daughter, often with a stereoscopic camera, well into her 20s. He also talked her girlfriends out of their clothes and into posing for group portraits, though when other people's naked children were involved, Florence chaperoned the sittings. None of those art studies, or none that survive, crossed the line into obscenity, and the family seems to have been unperturbed by them. They did, however, bury a painful secret that Anthony Penrose revealed in The Lives of Lee Miller, an illustrated biography of his mother. At the age of 7, Elizabeth had been raped, ostensibly by a family friend. All attempts to verify his identity, Penrose told me, have drawn a blank, and infected with gonorrhea. Venereal diseases were still incurable, so she was treated at a hospital and by her mother with disinfectant irrigations. The Millers also consulted a psychiatrist, Penrose said, who counseled them to tell Elizabeth that sex was merely a mechanical act and not the same thing as love, so the damage wasn't permanent. But the damage to a violated child, even one as resilient as Miller, is permanent in incalculable ways. Given the timing, the kindest interpretation of December Morn is that it represents a form of shock therapy, physical immodesty as a cure for shame. Whatever it was, Miller's story suggests that beauty can also be a form of camouflage, one that successfully deceives the beholder without offering much protection to the wearer. Her art was always improvised on the run, escaping from or to a man or a place, and she described her life as a water-soaked jigsaw puzzle, drunk in bits that don't match in shape or design. The memory of a trauma is often fractured in the same fashion by that most devious of camouflagers, the unconscious. Few artists achieve lasting renown without a body of work that is cumulative in its power, and Miller wasn't capable of sustained ambition. But her finest pictures, the semi-abstract desert landscapes, the poetic rubble of wartime London, the graphs of desolation from the battlefront, the sculptural female torsos which were considered shockingly phallic, tantalize you as they tantalized those who championed her career with the promise of what she might have achieved. Although Miller was expelled from nearly every school she attended, she was capable of focus when a subject or a teacher, more often the latter, excited her. She and her best friend collaborated on screenplays inspired by Anita Loos. At 18, having badgered her parents for a trip to Paris, she dumped her chaperone and enrolled in a course on stage design taught by the Hungarian artist Ladislas Medjes, who introduced her to experimental theater and to her destiny as a bohemian. Back in Poughkeepsie 8 months later and pining for the left bank, she continued her training in stagecraft at Vassar, did some acting with a local company, and studied dance, which led to a part in the chorus line of a risque Broadway revue. Success in the performing arts came easily to a quicksilver girl who was usually the most striking hopeful at a casting call. A few years later, Jean Cocteau, looking for an actress with the features and aplomb of a Greek statue, chose Miller, who had no experience on screen, for the lead role in his didactically outre first film, The Blood of a Poet. None of these promising forays, however, held Miller's fugitive attention. By the autumn of 1926, she had moved to Manhattan to take classes at the Art Students League and was earning her pocket money as a lingerie model. If one is to believe the story, Condé Nast noticed her crossing the street just in time to pull her from the path of an oncoming vehicle, and this fortuitous collision led to an interview with Edna Chase, Vogue's editor-in-chief. With a boyish haircut and a new moniker, Lee, a contraction of Lily, her family nickname, but also perhaps a little bow to that most enterprising flapper, Lorelei Lee, Miller made her debut in Vogue, on the March 1927 cover in a drawing by the French fashion illustrator Georges Lepape, and at the famous parties that Condé Nast hosted in his penthouse. She was soon posing for Steichen, Arnold Genta, and Nicolas Mouret, the leading photographers of the day. But the fact that she modeled for them is more interesting in retrospect than the decorous pictures they took of her. None capture her subversive modernity the way Lepape did, confronting the beholder from under a purple cloche with swollen lips and a sullen gaze that manages to project both wantonness and reserve. In 1929, with several lovers fighting for the honor of seeing her off, and Café Society sad to lose its star playgirl, Miller sailed for Europe with the ambition to enter photography by the back end. It was Steichen, she said, who put the idea into my head. She planned to do some modeling for George Hoyningen-Huene at Paris Vogue while she apprenticed with Man Ray, a leader of the avant-garde and a master of many genres: painting, photography, sculpture, and graphic art. After co-founding the Dada movement,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?